The principle of distance. Chapter 1. Flooding the avant-garde. Widespread and systematic proliferation of technical media in the modern age not only expands the channels through which we communicate, but also accelerates this process of communication. Already in the 90s, Nicolas Bourriaud named these information superhighways in his revival of the avant-garde strategy of artistic resistance. 30 years later, his relational aesthetic has become itself the unquestioned standard of practice in the visual arts, advocating for making friends, not art. Is this the historical point where the artwork disappears in favor of political activism or a social event? Once creating hangouts, group activities, and workshops in the gallery in place of the art object loses its rebellious edge, as these very activities become hardened in collective understandings and thus reproduced only as images of an original act. How is it possible to move forward? Music is lagging. For us, the relational turn has only just begun to take effect, and only in limited scope. Nevertheless, we inhabit the same world where the proliferation of technical media compromises the status of the real, where an arms race of illusion increasingly conceals even the nature of technical media itself, so that the conditions of production are hidden from the situation of consumption in favor of a user experience. Although the material of art is radically free, in that any sound or any object can be assimilated in the work, but now even the separation of disciplines becomes suspect. We ourselves become less free as the scale of the structures that constitute and control our immediate surroundings withdraw from our field of vision. In theater and media art, and in some strains of acoustic and electronic music, a positive reaction to this can be seen in the rise of immersive art, which literally engulfs its audience to create the unbroken experience of a virtual, fictional, or possible world. This world paradoxically leads both away from the conditions of the actual while deeply involving those very same conditions. In relation to the performance space, the bodies of those involved, the relation between performer and audience. Just as the flow of digital information never leaves our side in the era of the smartphone, so too do performances enclose the spectator in a virtual world of aesthetic experience. However, by and large, this trend naively embraces the totalizing VR aesthetic, prioritizing impact and photo or phonogenicity, resulting in neoliberal experience machines that simply function as a one-upmanship to the Hollywood blockbuster. The struggle against the culture industry is by now at least a century old and was a main focus of avant-garde art. Already with Duchamp and Bertolt Brecht was the main avant-garde strategy of disruption established, whereby the content within the frame of an artwork is either totally replaced, as in the case of the ready-mades, or some of its constitutive elements are displaced, in the case of characters breaking the fourth wall. This disrupts the structure of the flow of information within a traditional work of art. Later developments like minimalism or conceptual art only append this tradition by adding reduction to the repertoire, yet another type of disturbance to the established channels of a communication. Are these strategies, I ask, so reliable today when even noise, the very concept of interference and disruption, has become institutionalized? I assert that if we do not update the structure of the avant-garde, we remain at an aesthetic impasse where audiences dutifully subject themselves to their monthly scolding, agree and thank you for it, only to the return of the world of business as usual the next morning. If this continues, new music will become mere sound research or even disappear completely. The precarity of our position will only grow as Europe becomes engulfed in a real arms race. If we take the digestive process by which once radical art becomes harmless as an inevitable tension endemic to art's being in the world, it makes new forms of art necessary. I ask, perhaps in an era where revolution is, at least in the West, cliché, perhaps there are more subtle forms of artistic rebellion possible. What would it mean to disrupt this very process of disruption inscribed upon our discipline? Could the hardening of the social in resistance to the hardening of communication, again be softened? Or better yet, if further hardened, would it shatter? In a different direction, could the strategy of noise employed by the avant-garde of interference, dissolution, or displacement be amended or transplanted? Is it possible to play both sides, to invert these dried up resources and yet still avoid the pitfalls of naivete or anything goes? Furthermore, could a smoothing or streaming be appropriated as an act of defiance? Perhaps one could even speak of intervention by means of flooding, where instead of denying communication, fluid is excessively applied to the hardened territory, creating junctures in the form, formless flows to brittle tendons, destabilizing the entirety by exceeding its volume, erasing the known landscape, transforming the topography, eliminating ecosystems, and creating new ones. If human creativity can at all mirror the fictions we create, then perhaps it is appropriate for us to even play God in this case. With enough precipitation, maybe such a strategy can bend the highways of communication back on themselves. Chapter 2, the inflective and reflective. Ancient visions of apocalypse and blasphemous humor aside, am I really saying we need to make art wet? I contend that in our double niche of new music, where an organic cultural landscape is overshadowed by institutional geoengineering, wetter is better. Look at the weather. To make a flood, we need to make water fall in torrents from the heavens, and to do so, we assume the role of an Emirati fighter pilot spraying liquid nitrogen in the sky, or an omniscient infinite being with the ability to create from nothing. Whichever is more convincing. To destabilize artistic territory and by association the cultural apparatus that provides it life support, just add water in ridiculous quantities to counteract the ossification of over-institutionalization. This is not simply a manifesto for maximalist aesthetics. Rather, distinct principles can be drawn from my overuse of metaphor. Music, for its part, has always been plagued with metaphorical thinking, suppressed by the more serious practitioners and abused by the more indulgent. Terms like suspension, anticipation, deception, or dominant reveal that despite the Hanslickian insistence on sound and motion, we have always needed to anthropomorphize phenomena to make them at all comprehensible to us. Indeed, this trend is even growing, with recent advocates of vibrant matter or the agency of actor networks who claim to theorize from the perspective of and on behalf of objects, remaining curiously opaque about their own role as mediator. Furthermore, the act of relying on metaphors assumes the existence of and even itself produces a figurative, fictional world constructed in no small part by human imagination. When we inevitably stray from purely literal descriptions and transpose foreign qualities onto objects, phenomena, images, or concepts, combining things in a non-arbitrary, surprising, or even wrong way, we liquidate them, creating a spectral image of something that is not necessarily there. This is how traditional art functions when the inanimate clay or non-human vibrations are given life by human hands. The art historian David Summers describes a virtual space of representational painting. Philosopher Kendall Walton gives an account of the game of make-believe that produces fictional truths, and theater theorist Theresa Schütz writes of the Vereinnahmung, or engulfment, that occurs when we find ourselves absorbed by the work of the artwork. I henceforth refer to this dimension of the artwork as the inflective dimension, to account for its ability to take us in when we hear, view, or otherwise participate in it. On the other hand, the avant-garde has historically been concerned with displacing or even refusing the metaphorical, disrupting the appearance of a continuous fiction, or throwing our attention back outside the inner world of the figurative onto the actual conditions of the here and now of art's reception. Since the time of the Impressionists, the real world has increasingly pervaded the production of artworks. At every juncture, in every discipline from the 19th century till today, one can name examples of artworks and artists who turn away from the figurative, representational, fictional, virtual, imaginary, and towards the actual, real, present, abstract, or concrete as a way to disrupt the medial condition of traditional art. Art critic Michael Fried famously characterized the literalism of minimalist sculpture that would create its condition of objecthood. In performance studies, Erika Fischer-Lichte develops a concept of performance as Wirklichkeit konstituierend, or reality constituting, and philosopher Harry Lehmann speaks of the increasingly direct relation between music and reality in his Gehaltsästhetik. There might be a lack of consensus on how to describe this, but for my purposes, I will simply refer to this dimension that artists of the modern age break out into as the reflective dimension to account for its ability to varying degrees to throw attention back into the actual world in which we live, or the actual situation of art's reception. Between being in the fiction of the inflective dimension of art and the here and now of the reflective, I argue that the real takeaway of the avant-garde has not just been to disrupt the tradition in pursuit of newness, since these moments are ephemeral and subject to constant revision. Rather, they provide alternatives to the traditional metaphorical approach to art. Back to the issue of wetness. If we understand the avant-garde strategy to continuously throw the spectator out of or deny the fiction, then would disrupting the disruption mean to resuscitate the figurative or a profane return to narrative? Are there perhaps other ways still of amping up the fiction while still resisting the pull of the historical? How to do this in a way that nevertheless redeems the claim of newness in new music? I suggest that if we embrace the role that such games of make-believe impose upon us, we can mobilize the entire mechanism by which art alternatingly draws us in and spits us out, by manufacturing a vertiginous oscillation between the inflective and reflective, by flooding the old repertoire of disruption with too much liquid. Perhaps there still is room to create anew. Here, the principle of distance is at work. Chapter 3. To speak of the inflective or reflective dimensions of art is to imply the position of the audience and to formulate their relationship to the artwork. To put it bluntly, the inflective domain is somewhere inside the work, a spectral image created by figurated material. As the necessary ingredient in any aesthetic experience, we ourselves are the site of this inflection. We are always immersed in our own sensory experience. Art imposes its own world on top. Yet paradoxically, this domain also leads our attention away from the present moment, away from the situation of reception, into a virtual space, a fictional world, or expressive imagining. By bending back into itself and inside ourselves, we escape to somewhere else. So close as it may be situated, this inflective dimension creates a distance to the actual world. On the other hand, the reflective domain is outside the artwork, in the immediate material and temporal present of reception. We are always in the world. Even when engrossed in a fiction, our bodies never leave the concert hall, despite how it may feel. Here we also find a paradox. While reflection creates distance from the world of the work by stepping outside it, as in Bertolt Brecht's famous postlude to Der gute Mensch von Setzwan, it creates at the same time a sense of nearness to whatever that actual world outside figuration may be. When we encounter one of Rauschenberg's white paintings, we are strongly invited to consider the canvas itself as an object and the situation we encounter it in, causing these things to move to the foreground in our minds. If we take the work seriously, we pay them close attention.
Nice ride.
Want to give it a spin?
Coffee's enough excitement for me.
Come on.
It's important to note we've not left metaphorical territory. These dimensions are themselves lenses for interpretation, built upon conventions of perception of the same type. For this reason, we can refer to inflective and reflective levels of art as the metaphorical principle of distance. Just like the avant-garde strategies mentioned before, These traverse the virtual space or fictional worlds of art, and as such are metaphorical themselves. When we watch a film, we don't actually fly away to a distant and dusty planet where the oppressed population drink worm juice, no matter how much it may feel like that. There are, of course, varying degrees of strength to this principle. A quiet, delicate piece of music may be difficult to hear, causing us to lean forward and strain our ears. Perhaps in the process, we become aware of the limits of our own hearing. A stronger experience may be something of the contrary, whereby a piece becomes so loud we must shut our ears for fear of pain. Here, the high-energy vibrations quite literally press into us. Because of these implications, and to further resist against any perception that I propose simply a reification of past methods, I here introduce the complementary, literal principle of distance. Art does not happen in a vacuum. The galleries and concert halls and clubs and ateliers of our actual world have actual space with actual distance. Besides creating partially inflective, partially reflective metaphors of dealing with distance, there is the very concrete sense in which distance and its opposite can be manipulated. Physical contact between audience and performers, or between audience members. Upturning the concert or gallery dispositive with varying spatial arrangements. Perhaps even the concrete representations of space found in mechanical recordings. It is not to say that these literal ways of enacting distance cannot also be understood metaphorically. They almost always act in conjunction with metaphorical ones. Simply by presenting literal, concrete situations of distance in collusion with metaphorical ones, I hope to create a total conception of distance that can be applied to every level of the material, sound and situation the same. Chapter 4. If we flood the Elbphilharmonie, does it really become the Elbphilharmonie? Perhaps flooding a work means to take its principle a bit too seriously, to bend it back onto itself and ride this wave of feedback to some new horizon. At least as artists, we have the privilege of not being engineers, doctors, or politicians, so that most of the time, nobody dies when the raging waters tear down some careful shelter. Yet still, the urge and duty to back up talk with action persists. For lack of a clear principle of truth on behalf of the radically unstable and unfinished epistemology of art that comes with its fundamental subjectivity, I seek merely to show rather than prove. As I hinted in the opening of this lecture, the principle of distance stems from my reading of performance studies and theater theory. One could point to Therese Schutz's concept of immersion, whereby direct, intensive experience that is aimed at minimizing distance causes a temporary melting of fiction and reality, eventually the temporary abandonment of the environment in favor of an aesthetically configured possible world. This would be an example of the inflective dimension of the artwork. On the contrary, the performance theory of Erika Fischer-Lichte, which posits itself as not about the depiction of a fictional world, about the manufacturing of a communication between dramatic figures, but rather negotiating the relationships which apply to the actors and spectators, and which in this way constitute the reality of the theater. This can be read as indicative of the reflective domain. In the past, I focused on importing techniques from theater and performance into both the inflective and reflective domain in my own music in order to destabilize the concert situation and deny the audience the comfortable position of disinterested spectator. In my piece, It's Nice to Meet You from 2021, I created an arena for close contact, both physical and acoustic, on the theme of meat. With the piece Ghost in the Sheets from 2022, a deformed musical fiction spills over into the space of the audience. And in X-Chill of 2023, I founded a Kunstverein to transactionalize the relationship between music and immersive fictions. However, towards the end of this work cycle, I desired a more systematic treatment of inner musical ways of manipulating distance. Besides these performative interventions contained within the literal concept of distance, one can imagine music-immanent ways to approach this effect. Are there sounds that throw our attention back onto ourselves, that make apparent the physiology of our bodies? Is there music that is so obvious it becomes distracting, so banal it rejects our attention? Naturally, the opposite is also implied. Sounds that are so fascinating, they suggest worlds beyond worlds, so fine they create dimension and depth. This, of course, has been with us the entire time. But to flood the spectrum of inflective and reflective, virtual, fictional, other, actual, real, now, to enact them in conjunction with literal concepts of distance, I ask, where does this lead? One could begin to make lists of musical material which suits these ends. Under reflective, one can imagine first physical or physiological sounds. Perhaps too loud. That wasn't so loud, okay? Try it again. Perhaps too loud. Better. Or maybe too quiet. Something like a jump scare. Told you. Deep rumbling. Nails on a chalkboard? Another category might be psychological or psychoacoustic sounds, things that are incomprehensible. Too concrete or too indexical. Sounds that are perhaps too cliché. Sounds that are stupid or silly. Beating patterns? Tiny sounds, and sounds or material that might be too repetitive. On the other hand, on the opposite effect, under inflective, one can pin things like cadences, musical characters, gestures, figurations, otherwise any metaphorical treatment that comes from the history of music. For example, okay, we know that, but what if we combine them with something from the reflective category? And then there are ambiguous cases such as field recordings. And last but not least, silence. Of course, I must mention, much of this depends on the context. And in practice, much of this would probably be more ambiguous than in the theoretical laboratory.